cabin by the lake had always felt like a place where the world slowed down. It was small and simple, built from dark cedar wood that smelled warm and earthy after the rain. The porch creaked softly when someone stepped on it, and every morning the sunlight would spill through the tall pine trees and shimmer across the quiet water. For my husband Daniel and me, that cabin had never just been a property. It was our escape. Daniel's father had built the cabin decades ago with his own hands. Daniel used to tell me stories about how they spent summers there when he was a child, fishing at sunrise, fixing the dock together, and roasting marshmallows by the fire at night. After Daniel and I got married, his father welcomed me there like I had always belonged. This cabin is where family becomes family, he told me the first time I visited. And over the years, it truly became that for me. Daniel and I spent countless weekends there. When life became stressful, we packed a bag, drove 2 hours out of the city, and stayed at the cabin where the only sounds were birds, water, and the wind moving through the trees. It was where Daniel proposed to me again on our 5th anniversary, laughing as he held out a cheap plastic ring he bought from a gas station just for the joke. It was where we planned our future, and eventually it became the place where I tried to heal after losing him. Daniel passed away unexpectedly the previous winter. One moment we were planning our next trip to the lake, and the next moment my world had fallen apart. The cabin became the only place where I could still feel close to him. Every corner held a memory. His fishing rod still leaned against the wall near the door. His favorite mug sat in the kitchen cabinet. Even the wooden chair on the porch still creaked the same way it always had when he sat down with his morning coffee. But grief has a way of revealing people's true colors. Just a few weeks after Daniel's funeral, my mother-in-law Margaret began visiting the cabin more often. At first, I assumed she simply wanted to remember her son. I tried to be kind. After all, she had lost Daniel too. But something about her visits felt different. She didn't walk through the cabin the way someone does when they're remembering a loved one. Instead, she inspected things. She studied the walls, the furniture, the dock outside, and she was rarely alone. Her daughter Lisa often came with her. Lisa had never shown much interest in the cabin before. In fact, she used to complain about how boring it was compared to the city. But suddenly she was visiting every weekend. They walked around the property together, whispering quietly, occasionally pointing toward the dock, the trees, even the porch. At first I tried to ignore it, until one afternoon changed everything. I had stepped outside to bring in some firewood when I heard voices near the side of the cabin. Margaret and Lisa were standing by the old wooden fence. They didn't know I was close enough to hear them. Lisa crossed her arms and looked toward the lake. "It's smaller than I remember," she said. Margaret chuckled softly. "Oh, that won't matter," she replied confidently. "Once it's yours, you can change anything you want." Lisa raised an eyebrow. "Are you sure about that?" Margaret's voice lowered, but I could still hear every word. "Of course I'm sure," she said. "The cabin will be yours soon, I promise." The firewood slipped slightly in my hands. For a moment I thought I must have misunderstood. But their conversation continued. Lisa started talking about knocking down the dock and building a larger one. Margaret even mentioned repainting the entire cabin, like it already belonged to them. My heart began pounding. How could Margaret promise something like that? Daniel and I had lived there for years. It was our home. Trying to stay calm, I walked around the corner so they could see me. Both women immediately fell silent. Margaret's expression changed instantly, replacing her serious look with a polite smile. "Oh," she said lightly, "there you are." I set the firewood down slowly. I couldn't help overhearing something. I said. Margaret tilted her head. "What do you mean?" I looked directly at her. "You told Lisa the cabin would be hers." For a moment neither of them spoke. Then Margaret gave a soft laugh like the entire thing was a harmless misunderstanding. "Oh, sweetheart," she said with a dismissive wave of her hand, "this cabin has always belonged to our family." I felt my stomach tighten. "I am family," I replied quietly. Margaret's smile didn't fade, but something colder appeared behind her eyes. "Well," she said calmly, "we'll see about that." Lisa smirked slightly and looked out toward the lake again. In that moment, an uneasy feeling settled deep in my chest. Margaret hadn't sounded like someone making an empty promise. She sounded like someone who already believed the cabin belonged to her. And I had a sinking feeling this was only the beginning of something much worse. After that afternoon by the fence, something inside me shifted. Before, Margaret's visits had only felt uncomfortable. Now they felt calculated. Every time she arrived at the cabin with Lisa, it was as if they were surveying land they already owned. They walked along the dock measuring it with their eyes. They discussed the trees near the water as if deciding which ones to cut down. Lisa even brought a notebook one weekend, writing things down while Margaret pointed toward different parts of the property. I tried to convince myself that maybe I had misunderstood their earlier conversation, but deep down I knew I hadn't. The next family dinner confirmed my fears. Margaret had invited several relatives to her house. I almost didn't go, but I thought avoiding the situation would only make things worse. Daniel had always believed in facing problems directly, and I tried to remember that as I drove to her home. When I arrived, the house was already full of chatter and laughter. At first, everything seemed normal. But then, halfway through dinner, Margaret set down her fork and casually said something that made the entire room go quiet. "Well," she announced with a proud smile, "Lisa will be spending a lot more time at the cabin soon." My fork froze in midair. Across the table, Lisa gave a small, excited laugh. "I'm already thinking about redecorating it," she said. "The place needs some modern touches." Several relatives looked confused. One of Daniel's cousins glanced at me before asking carefully, "Wait, I thought Emily lived there." Margaret waved her hand dismissively. "Oh, she does for now," she said calmly, "but things will be changing." The words hit me like ice water. I set my fork down slowly. "What exactly does that mean?" I asked. Margaret looked at me as if I had asked a silly question. "It means the cabin should stay in the family." She replied sweetly, "I am family." I said quietly. Her smile tightened. "Well," she said, leaning back in her chair, "you were Daniel's wife." The way she said "were" made my chest ache. It was as if Daniel's death had erased my place entirely. The room grew awkwardly silent. Finally, Margaret changed the subject, but the damage had already been done. Everyone had heard her, and everyone now knew what she believed. Over the next few weeks, things only got worse. Margaret began telling relatives that Lisa would soon be moving into the cabin permanently. She talked about it as if it were already settled. Meanwhile, Lisa started visiting the property even when Margaret wasn't there. One Saturday morning, I woke up to the sound of a car pulling into the gravel driveway. When I stepped outside, I saw Lisa standing near the porch holding a measuring tape. She barely acknowledged me. "I'm checking the space for furniture," she said casually. I stared at her in disbelief. "For what furniture?" She shrugged. "For when I move in, obviously." Anger burned in my chest. "You're not moving in," I said firmly. "This is my home." Lisa gave me a look that was almost amused. "Maybe you should talk to my mother about that," she replied. That same afternoon, Margaret arrived. She walked up the porch steps slowly, as if she were visiting property she owned. "We need to talk," she said. I crossed my arms. "I think we do." Margaret sat down at the porch table and folded her hands calmly. "You should start thinking about moving out," she said as casually as if she were discussing the weather. For a moment I couldn't even process the words. "Excuse me, Lisa needs the cabin," Margaret continued. "It's time for her to settle down somewhere peaceful." My disbelief quickly turned to anger. "You can't just tell me to leave," I said. Margaret raised an eyebrow. "Why not?" "Because Daniel and I lived here," I replied. "This is our home." Margaret leaned forward slightly. "You may believe that," she said slowly, "but things aren't always what they seem." Something about the way she said it made my stomach twist. "What does that mean?" I asked. She smiled. A thin, confident smile. It means you shouldn't get too comfortable. Then she stood up and walked toward her car. Before getting in, she turned back toward me. You may want to start packing, she said calmly, and then she drove away. 3 days later, a letter arrived in my mailbox. At first, I assumed it was just another bill or advertisement. But when I opened it, my hands began to shake. It was an official notice. Margaret had filed paperwork claiming ownership of the cabin. For a long time, I simply stood there in the kitchen staring at the letter. Losing Daniel had already broken my heart. But now it felt like his family was trying to erase the last piece of my life with him. What Margaret didn't realize, however, was that Daniel's father had always been a careful man. And somewhere in the county records was the truth. The letter Margaret filed didn't just shake me. It ignited something inside me. For days I barely slept. Every creak of the cabin walls, every gust of wind through the pine trees made me wonder how long I would be allowed to stay in the place that had once felt like home. But the more I thought about Margaret's words, the less sense they made. Daniel and I had lived in the cabin for years. His father had always treated it like it belonged to us. He even gave Daniel a set of keys long before we were married. Why would Margaret suddenly think she had the right to take it? Still, the official letter made everything feel frighteningly real. So I drove into town the next morning and visited the county clerk's office. The building was old and quiet, filled with dusty filing cabinets and shelves stacked with property records going back decades. A kind woman at the front desk helped me search for the cabin's documents. It took nearly an hour. When she finally found the record file, she frowned slightly. She murmured, flipping through the pages. Is something wrong? I asked nervously. She shook her head. No, actually, she said slowly. It's just interesting. Before I could ask what she meant, she handed me a photocopy of a document. My eyes moved quickly across the page, and then my breath caught. It was a deed, a legal property deed. Signed by Daniel's father years earlier, but the name listed as the new owner wasn't Margaret. It wasn't Lisa. It was me. The woman at the desk smiled gently when she saw my reaction. According to this, she said, tapping the page, the cabin was transferred into your name quite some time ago. My heart pounded as the realization settled in. Daniel's father had given the cabin to me, legally, completely. Margaret must have never known. For the first time in weeks, I felt something I hadn't felt since Daniel died. Relief, but I didn't tell Margaret right away. Instead, I waited, and it didn't take long for the situation to explode. A week later, I woke early to the sound of loud voices outside the cabin. When I stepped onto the porch, my stomach dropped. Margaret's car was parked in the driveway, so was a moving truck. Lisa stood beside it with 2 men unloading empty boxes. Margaret noticed me immediately and smiled smugly. Well, she said loudly, there she is. What is this? I demanded. Lisa gestured toward the cabin. I'm moving in today. My hands clenched at my sides. You're not moving anywhere, I said firmly. Margaret stepped forward. I think you're confused, she replied calmly. This property belongs to our family. It does, I said. And Daniel was my family. Margaret's expression hardened. You've had plenty of time, she snapped. Now it's time to leave. I'm not leaving. Her eyes narrowed. Then we'll handle this the proper way. She pulled out her phone and stepped away. 20 minutes later, a sheriff's vehicle pulled into the driveway. By then, several curious neighbors had gathered near the road, watching the argument unfold. Margaret crossed her arms confidently as the sheriff stepped out of his car. Officer, she said quickly, this woman is refusing to leave our property. The sheriff looked between us calmly. All right, he said, let's slow down and figure out what's going on. Margaret immediately handed him a folder of papers. These documents show that the cabin belongs to our family, she said. The sheriff opened the folder and examined the contents carefully. After a moment he frowned. These aren't ownership records, he said. Margaret blinked. What do you mean? These are tax papers and maintenance records, he explained. They don't prove ownership. Margaret's confidence began to falter slightly. Well, the cabin belonged to my husband, she insisted. So it's obviously ours. The sheriff nodded slowly. Do either of you have the official deed? Margaret hesitated. I assumed we had it. The sheriff turned toward his vehicle. I actually stopped by the county clerk's office on my way here, he said. Since there was a dispute filed, my heart beat faster. Margaret looked irritated. Well, that should settle things then, she said. The sheriff walked back holding a document, a single piece of paper. Let's see what the records say, he said calmly. By now, several neighbors had moved closer, curious about the commotion. Even the movers had stopped unloading the truck to listen. Margaret stood with her chin lifted confidently. Lisa folded her arms beside her. The sheriff cleared his throat and began reading the document aloud. The property located at Lakewood Cabin Road is hereby transferred to... He paused briefly. The entire driveway fell silent, and Margaret's confident smile slowly began to fade. The entire driveway had fallen silent. Even the wind moving through the tall pine trees seemed to pause as the sheriff held the document in his hands. Margaret stood with her arms crossed, her chin lifted confidently like someone already celebrating victory. Lisa leaned against the moving truck, watching with a smug smile. They both looked completely certain of the outcome. The sheriff adjusted his glasses and continued reading the deed. The property located at Lakewood Cabin Road is hereby transferred to... He paused briefly, scanning the page. My daughter-in-law Emily. For a moment nobody moved. It felt like the entire world had frozen. Then whispers began spreading through the small group of neighbors gathered along the road. Margaret blinked. What? She said sharply. The sheriff continued reading calmly. This transfer of ownership is signed and legally recorded by the previous owner, Robert Hale, effective immediately upon filing. Robert Hale, Daniel's father. My fingers tightened slightly at my sides as emotions rushed through me. The sheriff lowered the paper and looked directly at Margaret. According to county records, he said clearly, the cabin belongs to Emily. Lisa's confident posture collapsed instantly. What? She snapped, stepping forward. That can't be right. Margaret grabbed the paper from the sheriff's hand and scanned it quickly. The color slowly drained from her face. This must be a mistake. She stammered, but it wasn't. The signature at the bottom of the deed was unmistakable. Daniel's father had signed it years ago. The sheriff gently took the document back and handed it to me instead. Ma'am, he said respectfully, this property is legally yours. The weight of the paper in my hands felt almost unreal. For weeks Margaret had made me feel powerless. She had treated me like an outsider, like someone who no longer belonged. But the truth had been quietly waiting in the county records the entire time. Lisa turned toward her mother in disbelief. You told me the cabin was ours, she said angrily. Margaret looked flustered for the first time since Daniel's funeral. Well, it should have been, she muttered, but the situation was already unraveling. The neighbors watching from the roadside had heard everything. The movers awkwardly began putting their empty boxes back into the truck. One of them scratched his head and asked Lisa, So we're not unloading? Lisa didn't answer. She simply stared at the cabin like it had betrayed her. Margaret, however, wasn't ready to give up her pride so easily. She turned toward me, her voice suddenly sharp. You manipulated him, she accused. You must have convinced Robert to sign that. The accusation hung in the air. But this time, I didn't feel the need to defend myself. Instead, I simply shook my head. Your husband made his own decisions, I said quietly. Margaret scoffed. He wouldn't give it to you over his own daughter. But deep down, I think she already knew the truth. Robert Hale had always been fair, and he had watched how Margaret treated people for years. Maybe he knew exactly what would happen after he was gone. Maybe that was why he made sure the cabin would stay with the person who truly loved it, not the one who simply wanted to claim it. The sheriff stepped forward slightly. All right, he said firmly. Since the ownership is clear, there's nothing more to discuss. He turned toward Margaret and Lisa. You'll need to remove the truck from the property. Margaret looked like she wanted to argue, but the crowd of neighbors watching silently made it impossible. Lisa climbed into the moving truck without another word. Margaret followed slowly, her face tight with humiliation. Within minutes, The truck pulled out of the driveway and disappeared down the road. The small group of neighbors gradually drifted away as well, murmuring quietly about what they had just witnessed. Soon the property was quiet again, just like it used to be. The sheriff tipped his hat politely before returning to his car. "If anyone gives you trouble again," he said kindly, "you have the deed." Then he drove away. I stood alone on the porch for a moment, holding the document carefully. The late afternoon sunlight shimmered across the lake. The water moved gently against the old wooden dock. And for the first time in months, the cabin felt peaceful again. Margaret had promised the cabin to her daughter, but it had never been hers to promise. Robert had made sure of that, and now, standing there with the deed in my hands, I realized something important. Sometimes the sweetest revenge isn't fighting back. Sometimes it's simply letting the truth speak for itself.